Okay, so I laid the quick groundwork that in Durkheim's understanding of how social classification work, it's binary systems of hierarchical relations. I'll have some more examples, but let me take you back to what Durkheim was thinking. His idea was that during a ritual, the markings of the sacred and the profane emerge. So importantly, classification, i.e. the sacred profane binary system of classification, is not natural. It's not pre-existing, floating out there in the world like Plato thought it was, something for us to discover and then kind of see, realize. Instead, for Durkheim, it is actually born of these ritual moments. It comes from the fact that we're a society. And his idea was that the most fundamental religious practices of keeping the sacred and the profane apart, and the most fundamental religious beliefs of the sacred and the profane come from these ritual moments. Now, when I say religious, keep in mind that Durkheim understood kind of the nature of culture and the way moral order and society all work together. He understood it by looking at religious systems, especially these primitive societies. And so let me give you a couple examples. So he would say, well, in these primitive rituals that he's been reading about from primitive societies, you could see in these ritual moments, all of a sudden, genders start to be segregated. So women over here and men over here. And then all of a sudden, he would notice through reading these histories that the rituals happened at certain places, but not other places. So if we were the Turtle Clan, the ritual tended to happen over here near where the turtle breeding ground was, but not over there in the dry area. And then he also noticed that rituals would happen at certain times of day. So why was it that for this particular tribe, the ritual was always happening late at night, only when a full moon rose, but maybe for another clan, their rituals happened at a different time? What he was noticing is that in natural differences, say for example of sex, became socially important by the segregation of genders, and hence you get the beginnings of power relations and different gender roles. He noticed too that in these ritual moments then space and time began to be divided, and for him the divisions were always these binary divisions that could, if divided enough, be quite complex, because any binary divisions, say, can always be subdivided like this. So Durkheim and people that followed after him would make these really kind of complex systems of how time and space and social relations and family lineages were all divided, and it was all based on this binary system. And what's important in the Durkheim sense is that also the sacred and profane was marked. So it was both marked on people. So if you have that turtle tattooed on your shoulder, then there's a sense of kind of the sacred having been floated or settled onto you. And if other people from other tribe come, they don't have that turtle. Well, in the Durkheimian sense, they're classified as other because they don't have the sacred marking. Therefore, they're profane. So you see how for Durkheim, he has this kind of brilliant realization that it's really society projecting out into the world in all sorts of ways. Time, space, people, objects, that classification happens. And you have what, as I mentioned in the last lecture, you have the importance of totemic objects, so totems. So in a ritual, it might be that if a certain group is in a space and the turtles are there and they become the Turtle Clan, well, that turtle is incredibly sacred, and so therefore maybe eating rules develop around the turtle. So you can't eat the sacred, your sacred object, what for the society is most sacred. Not because, and this is important for Durkheim, not because the turtle, is actually sacred in some sort of like natural way, but because it's a part of the society's own marking of space and time and actually generating moral order out of the universe. So that's always important for Durkheim, is that moral order is created out of these social actions that occur, collective representations, and then in this most basic sense, these sacred, profane, binary distinctions. What's important too for Durkheim is that then all of a sudden you have these regulation systems that arise to keep the sacred and profane apart, to keep that distinction. And as I started off the lecture with kind of these examples of classification processes, like, for example, teenage, well, that's a classification process that's arose for us as a way to keep clear markings. So this childhood and adult thing, we want to keep them separate from each other. So we kind of invent this teenage thing, but then within the teenage thing, we start talking about preteens and maybe late teens. And for Durkheim, that's a great example of how when uncertainty rises and has a possibility of making the sacred and profane like come too close and mix, i.e. childhood and adulthood, other classification decisions will be made by a social group, usually unconsciously, to make sense out of that chaos. Now keep in mind that classification processes are not necessarily about defining or about, they're not about naming natural relationships that already exist, but they're about making sense and defining the relationships between things, between you and I and our social group, between the places that we live, between the things that we eat, between the whole world around us. And naming, of course, or classifying isn't about necessarily conscious choices, because you and I are born into classification systems, right? And that's one of the most important things that sociologists do, is to help us to open our eyes to see that we're actually already born into this thing called society that's already ongoing, that has a whole classification system that to you and me seems natural because we're born into it, but actually has been created over time. And Durkheim helped expose how that was created. And these sets of rules for managing the sacred and profane, so these regulation systems that became set up and became religion. So this is important for Durkheim. He sees religion as kind of the ultimate social system of management for the sacred and profane and keeping order together. These things that are set up and that we see as religion or we see as certain beliefs are primarily for Durkheim about keeping society together. So classification is about maintaining social order. Now, what's important, if you think about back to these ritual moments of Durkheim, we leave those moments. So we've talked about in the last lecture how getting outside of those moments can be liminal, can be a gray area, can be confusing. But because regulation systems develop, and because sacred objects like that tattoo that we might have on our shoulder, or like that wedding ring you might get in your wedding ceremony, we take those out of those intensive social moments, we carry them with us, because they actually help to remind us of that defining ritual moment, as well as that sacred and profane distinction that got set up in those moments. So one great example of regulations, and you've no doubt heard this word before, but are taboos. Now taboos are sets of classification rules whose violation, so if you violate the taboo, leads to disorder or impurity. So there would be taboo. Durkheim points out, both in the primitive societies he was studying, as well as today, taboos are around food, they're around activities, and really what taboos are, if you scratch it and think through Durkheim's thoughts, are really rules simply to kind of keep the sacred and profane system of classification operating. And for Durkheim, again, these systems of classification based on these binary sacred profane distinction really keeps society together. It's what allows kind of humans out of the chaos of the natural world to actually kind of keep ourselves together. And I'm going to put in a slide right here. And on that slide, you'll see a couple of Durkheim's kind of key basic quotes that give you the sense of the level that he was talking about. Now, keep in mind here that when we say sacred and profane in a Durkheimian sense, we're not talking just about good slash bad. Because it would be possible for us to walk away from this concept saying, oh, well, moral order is just about good and bad. Well, to be more technical for Durkheim, moral order was about the protection of whatever a society's sacred was. And you can often figure out kind of what is the sacred core. And again, this doesn't mean good in a universal sense, but it means the moral order. What's the core of moral order for society? And you can figure this out often through looking at taboos. So where are people snapped back into line, kept in line with order? But you can also look at it, find this kind of core sacred area by seeing where conflict happens or violence occurs, where a social group will use conflict and violence to keep order. So for a moment, you might think about, say, from the founding of this country, really, up until certainly the 1960s, you might think that systematic racial violence against minority groups, that's one place that we could see where a sacred is enforced. Now, this is to help you understand that sacred does not equal good, but instead equals the moral core, the main ordering principle of a social group. And if we look at systematic racial violence against minority groups, one way of understanding this sort of violence is that it's a way that the dominant portion of a society that sees itself as the core and as keeping order of society is protecting the sacredness of society. In other words, we are a certain way, we look a certain way, we treat people a certain way, and not everybody is a part of society in this most perfect way. And so surely, in a Durkheimian sense, this is a core sacred. You can think the easy example, of course, is the pre-civil rights movement, white South and even the white North, where the KKK was actually more powerful. And you can see that racial violence, such as lynching, in the most horrific example of this, was really about a way of maintaining sacred, profane relationships for these societies, these states, and these counties, and these cities, and these small towns, of keeping literally mixing of races, literally mixing of spaces where different racial groups work. That sort of violence reveals to us as sociologists a sacred profane system of classification at work, albeit as we see now, kind of a horrifically unjust system, but still nonetheless a sacred profane system of classification at work. And we can talk about it in those binary classification relationships, even if at that time it wasn't talked about quite in that way. Keep in mind then that every society and every social group classifies people, places, behavior, time, all sorts of things like that. It's a fundamental social process. So even though we live in an age where we oftentimes resist making classifications between peoples, nonetheless, there are still classifications that are always occurring. Some, as in the example I've mentioned, that are worse than others, but classification is constantly occurring. And after the break, I'll come back and show you some examples on that.